When we think of trench warfare, we think of World War I. While World War I was certainly the height of modern trench warfare, the technique itself has originated since the 17th century used in taking down fortresses. There were also instances of early trench warfare being used in wars such as the Crimean War. But in terms of modern style full-scale trench warfare, where there's miles of trenches being dug, massive artillery and rapid-fire weapons were constantly blazing, the first major instance is actually the American Civil War. At the Battle of Cold Harbor, then the Siege of Petersburg, you see World War I style trench warfare 50 years before Franz Ferdinand was even shot. This video is a part of a collaboration with the Armchair Historian and I, where we make some videos over the American Civil War. Be sure to subscribe to them, especially since he's graciously agreed to read some quotes for this video. Fancy, right? So what really ended up changing trench warfare to the miserable, gray, endless death barrage that we think of was rapid-fire weapons. Trench warfare at first was used to hide from your enemy's artillery, but rapid-firing weapons made them completely necessary to avoid getting your head blown off. With World War I, there was the Maxim machine gun, but before that weapon there was the Gatling gun. The Gatling gun, while slower than the Maxim gun, could still be fed ammo and cranked to unleash a lot of bullets at a rapid pace, especially considering it took often a minute to reload a Civil War rifle. It doesn't even need to be as fast as the Maxim gun to be effective. As the situation got more desperate for Robert E. Lee's army in Virginia, he began to use more defensive measures. Union General Ulysses S. Grant proved to be willing to press forward, unlike past generals, as he had more men and supplies. Lee did not have that luxury, as his force kept withering day by day. As the Union got closer to the Confederate capital of Richmond, Lee decided to make a stand at Cold Harbor. Cold Harbor actually was neither a harbor, nor was it really cold since it was June, but the cold part would in a way still be accurate for what was to come. On May 31st, the battle began. At first, it was necessary for the Union side to dig trenches to avoid Confederate artillery fire, but the Union was trying to take the Confederate position, so they needed to advance forward. But this initial advantage of the Confederates gave Robert E. Lee time to build his own trenches and fortifications. They were very impressive for the time. Historian James McPherson wrote, let me get my Dan Carlin on. It was the most ingenious defensive configuration the war had yet witnessed. Intricate, zigzagged lines within lines, lines protecting flanks of lines. It was a maze and labyrinth of works within works. End quote. It just goes to show how from a viewing position you can take the horror of war and out in awe about... Okay, enough Dan Carlin, that does a number on my voice. Now let's hear what a Confederate soldier thought as he wrote in his diary.
We went to work, immediately erecting some works. We made splendid fortifications for the working utensils we had. Our company only had one spade and a hoe, and some wooden shovels we made out of planks.
Wooden shovels, one spade, and a gardening hoe. This shows how low on supplies the Confederates were towards the end. As you can imagine, a wooden shovel isn't exactly as effective as a metal one, but they were able to still build their trenches. Often trench warfare develops as a part of a desperate situation. You're outnumbered, you're dealing with rapid fire, and you need to win, so you build trenches. But for General Lee, this ended up being a good choice, as in spite of being outnumbered, he was able to inflict 2.5 times as many casualties on the Union side. But of course, in spite of the horrible losses, Grant wasn't going to retreat back to Washington. The next step was to take the Confederate capital of Richmond, so close to where Cold Harbor was. But to do that, you need to cut off its supplies, so it can't defend itself. The last major supply source was the city of Petersburg to its south. The battle had already begun while Cold Harbor was nearing a close, but with Cold Harbor over, the situation increased in scope as it became a siege. Well, kind of. It's not a siege in the sense of the city being surrounded, but rather the supply line to Petersburg is cut off and the Union forces surrounded the eastern, southern, and northern sides of Richmond-Petersburg. So even though they weren't technically cut off, in terms of supplies it essentially was. Once again, both sides dug trenches along the front, over 30 miles worth of them. One Union soldier had this to say as the fighting picked up.
We went out on our left on the 30th of June and cut a railroad and destroyed about 6 or 8 miles and then came back. We tore up the road and piped the ties up on piles, and then laid the rails on top, and then set fire to them, and the rails got hot, bent and crooked, so they will be of no use anymore for the road. The roads are all cut, I believe, and I think the Rebs will have some hungry bellies before long, so I look for some hard fighting before long.
Well, rather than hard fighting before long, it was hard fighting for a long time. The siege would last for 9 months. Similar to World War I, the trench warfare not only extended the fighting but made the casualties higher. Gatling guns were naturally present, making it a true example of modern trench warfare. Out of roughly 52,000 Confederate soldiers, 28,000 either got injured or killed, over half their men. The Union had 42,000 wounded or dead, but their strength, depending on historical estimates, was as high as 125,000. A lot of casualties, but not the same proportions, and the Union could still draft way more people than the South at this point. As time passed on, it seemed to highlight the idea that perhaps the Confederates were just delaying the inevitable. The siege would end on March 25th of 1865. Petersburg would fall on April 3rd, with Richmond the same evening. Confederate President Jefferson Davis had fled, and Robert E. Lee's army retreated. Lee would end up surrendering on April 9th at Appomattox Courthouse. These two battles showed the destructiveness of trench warfare and how the now classic style of Napoleonic warfare was drawing to a close. The American Civil War had other evolutions of warfare, such as armor-clad naval fighting, truly making this conflict a turning point in the history of warfare. The imagery of World War I was truly foreshadowed by the end of the Civil War. I'll see you guys next time.